Thank you, Jasmine. It's funny that you mentioned about engaged employees. I was going to put that, it is in my talk, but one of the first interviews I ever did for my podcast was Chuck Drucker, who founded this organization, and our whole conversation was about how the biggest driver of customer loyalty is happy employees and the experience they have in the buying process. So it's outweighs product or anything else. That's the key thing. So I'm going to talk about culture and content today, and I want to tell you it's a lot of things I've been thinking about. I think about culture a lot. I'm not a cultural expert. I'm just an observer, so I'm not going to tell you what your culture should be, but I want to talk about how you might communicate it in a way that's both attractive to customers and helps reinforce the culture you want to have inside your company. So this morning we heard several people talk about how important it is and how it should come from leadership. So that's kind of where I'm headed. I want to start by talking about Pixar. So you might wonder how Woody and Buzz Lightyear are related to culture in the life sciences. So I did a little research for this talk, and it turns out that at Pixar they were having troubles with getting people to work together in the right way, and it's a bunch of creatives and so on. And I read an article in the Harvard Business Review that you should definitely look at. So I'm going to ignore my slides today. I'm not even going to show them to you. I have them. I have a QR code that will get you to them, and that's not a trick to get you to talk to me, but I rearranged my whole talk over the last week based on a podcast I listened to last week. So, but the deal at Pixar was, I'm going to back up. So what is Pixar? How is Pixar like the life sciences? Well, making any movie requires a huge upfront investment. There are thousands of decisions that have to be made along the way, and the outcome or the success is uncertain until all the work is done, right? And you know that if you sit through the credits of all movies like I do, you see how many hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people are involved in making that. And you might think Toy Story is a cartoon, and we take it for granted now because we see animation everywhere. But at the time, Toy Story was the first full-length computer-generated animated movie, and they weren't just developing a cool story, they were developing the technology to deliver that at the same time, right? So lots of problems. So if you think marketing and sales are siloed, picture a bunch of creatives sitting around in a room telling coders how they want Mr. Potato Head to be able to switch out body parts. So the takeaway of the Harvard Business Review article was really that ideas was not the limitation on creativity. It was about getting people to work together. And that's kind of what I want to reinforce, is that the real opportunity for success is getting people to work together. The takeaway from the article was that people are more important than ideas. You can give a good idea to a mediocre team and get nothing. You can give a mediocre idea to a good team, and they will make it work. I wanted to say one more thing about that, but maybe it will come to me. So, we'll let it go. So when David Weber called me and said, "What do you want to talk about?" I had some ideas. And another early episode of my podcast, which you should listen to, was from Taia Ergueta. She was a mentor of mine at Varian. She had come up through Hewlett-Packard and then Agilent when they spun off. And when she came to Varian, she came to me and said, because my team was responsible for the intranet, I want to write some blog posts, and the first one I want to write is how you can change a company through marketing communications. And she had a lot of wisdom around this. A lot of it was around being customer focused, of course, focusing on storytelling. She was very much thought it was a mistake to spend all your budget on product launches, because most people at any given time aren't looking for your product, but they're always interested in a story. And then there were processes that Marcom could develop to elevate their game in parallel with R&D, for example, or product marketing. So that was one idea. And the other thing that interests me is, it seems to me, well, I also did an interview earlier this year. This is another obsession of mine of how hard it is to get people to change their behavior. I spoke to Thomas Farb-Horch, who's currently the CEO of Thrive Biosciences. They have an imaging platform. This guy has founded 17 companies. 7 of them have turned into unicorns. But the biggest challenge we were talking about was how hard it is to get people to change how they do things, whether inside the company or just your customers' workflows. So that's another issue. And then the other thing that occurred to me, like if we're going to create content that both attracts customers and influences the culture within our own company, where would we put it and what would it look like? So it seems to me, I don't know if you all still experience this, but there's a gap at the top of the funnel about awareness. This was driven home to me at the ASMS meeting that I went to many years ago. If you haven't been to mass spectrometry meeting, on the show floor, every exhibitor gets just a 10-foot booth. There's barely room to have a conversation, let alone show any products, especially mass spectrometers, which are large. So all the vendors get a room like this and have a hospitality suite where they can talk to customers, they can display their products and feed a bunch of hungry and thirsty graduate students. I was standing at a cocktail table one night with a guy probably mid-late career. Clearly somebody knew what he was doing. I assume he's an analytical chemist or he wouldn't be at the meeting. And there's a slideshow going on a screen. And Varian had a huge product line besides mass spectrometry. Of course, they have chromatography, dissolution, spectroscopy, and a slide came up of our cute little new NMR magnet, the 400 megahertz. And he looks at me and he says, I didn't know Varian made NMR. And I was shocked. Because if you know NMR, there were only 2 dominant companies making NMRs. It was Bruker and Varian, and he didn't know one of them. In fact, the first MRI, fun fact, was done on a Varian imaging, magnetic resonance, and just an NMR. That's how they figured out we could do imaging on MRI. So that made it clear to me that no matter where you think you are, you're not necessarily in the worldview of your customer. People, has anybody ever seen, this is kind of a sidetrack, the video about the gorilla and the basketball passing? Yeah, that's the thing. So, short story, you watch this video, you're asked to count how many times the team in the white shirts passes the basketball to another person in the white shirts. That all happens, it goes on, you think you know the answer, and at the end, someone says, how many of you saw the gorilla? What? Then they show you the movie again, and while this whole game is going on, a person comes out in a gorilla suit, pounds their chest right in the middle of the screen, and walks off. And everybody missed it. Like 75% of the people will not see that. So people are focused on their own little world. We need to get their attention. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so we talked about, culture is critical for success. There's an awareness gap. Can we use content to generate awareness about our companies and also influence the culture? So going back to Chuck Drucker, who started this whole organization, I think it can work because smart people, like people we're trying to reach, and everybody in this room wants to know how other people solve problems. It doesn't matter what the problem is. That's why you're all here, right? It's what we've been doing all day long. So can we create content around how our company solves problems? Can we talk about the way we do things, the way we interact, not just about our products or how we make things, but that's a good one too. But let's talk about our culture. And I think that would be an attractive proposition. So you can influence culture at at different levels through your content. I'm going to give you some examples, some of which will be influencing culture and some of them reflect culture. And at the end, I'm going to bring it together and give you an example where I think it can do both. So I already mentioned Tahir Geta. She was really focused on storytelling versus product launches. Early on, I had a chance to talk to Jeff Mazzeo, who was at the time, I don't know if he still is, the VP of Waters. And at the time, they were really trying to shift their culture from being technology focused to being more customer focused. And the quote that stood out to me, and all these quotes are on there on my slide deck, was that they're really trying to solve business problems. And I think what that can do for your business, if you say, this is the way we're going to communicate to customers, and this is what we're trying to do for them, you might get your marketing teams to start thinking about different problems they can solve. So rather than, how can we get a better analytical result, what is our customer trying to do at a higher level, and can we think of new ways to make it better for them? Maybe it's a workflow innovation, and it has nothing to do with your product, right? So that's a possibility. Paul Broman started a podcast at Illumina. It's called the Illumina Podcast. And at the time, Illumina had like an 80% market share in next-gen sequencing. And their strategy was not to gobble up the remaining 20%, but rather to expand the pie. He thought, and this is my favorite kind of marketing, who could be using sequencing but isn't? So he talked to people about, he went out and he interviewed people for the podcast that were using next-gen sequencing in unique ways to kind of inspire other people to think, could sequencing solve some problem that I have? And that information comes back into the company and helps them with product development, but also has the mindset of reaching out to an entirely different audience, right? So now that's a bit of a change. And then one episode that I will never forget, because it was a little unusual, was with Andy Bertera. He's been on my podcast twice. But we talked about how the culture at New England Biolabs influences their marketing tactics. The reason I won't forget that episode is it's a quiet afternoon in January 2020. And just as we're starting, the Amazon guy comes to the door, rings the doorbell, and my dog starts barking like crazy. And Andy said, that's cool, leave it in there. So if you listen to that episode, you get to hear what my dog sounds like whenever someone's in the driveway. On the other side, besides storytelling, there's the technological side, which we've heard a lot from today. Grace's talk was a perfect example of companies changing how they deliver their content. So Rebecca Rapucci and I talked about what they were doing at Cell Signaling. This, I think, was back in 2018 or so. And they switched their marketing budget completely upside down, where they had been spending 60% of their budget on print materials. And then they switched to going 100% digital all in 1 year. That's a pretty radical shift. I think that sends a message to the company about how we think about interacting with customers, but it aligned with their philosophy of minimizing waste and taking care of the environment. And then, and also related to what Grace was talking about, Harisi Smartsadoo, and somebody mentioned LifeTech earlier today. She was at Thermo. It's not hard to imagine, if you look at the acquisition of LifeTech, that it wasn't just about expanding their product lines, but expanding their marketing capabilities, because as it was pointed out, they were young and youthful and doing things differently, and Thermo isn't necessarily known for that. So hopefully, and I've seen the change, so it clearly worked out. So that's another possible way to change the culture inside the company, to say we're going digital. Harisi's point was that we're not just competing with other companies in our industry anymore. You're competing with Amazon for the buying experience. You compete with Netflix for your attention, and that's the game we're playing. That's the world we live in, because our phones are training us on everything that's possible, and if you're not doing it like anybody else, you're a laggard. Okay, so I just mentioned Netflix. We're going to go back to the movies for a minute, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of examples. But Netflix culture is interesting. I talked about Pixar already. Netflix their key metric for success is monthly retainer retention, or monthly customer retention. So that's a big deal for them. It's a big deal because this year they're going to spend $17 billion generating new content. And they need to know that next month, when you push the button on your remote, and I still don't know how they got their own button on a remote. That's for next year's meeting, because that would be awesome. They need to know that you're going to find new and interesting content there. So Netflix is, again, another big company, and what was important to them was that decisions could be made quickly. Netflix is interesting because they actually published their culture document. I have a link to it in my slide deck. Good news is, well, the bad news is it's only 129 slides. The good news is it's been revised down to a single page, and I have a link for that too. But the slide that caught my attention was about freedom and responsibility. So Netflix encourages a culture where expectations are clear about what you can do. They're also very clear about the kind of people they want to hire and the kind of people they'd be happy to let go. And they're very explicit about it in saying, if one of your employees comes to you and says, hey, I'm thinking about looking for another job, would you fight to keep them? Would you write them a check and send them on their way? And because they really have an expectation of high performance from all their employees. But the freedom and responsibility thing was to enable quick decisions. They said we cannot be micromanaging every decision. We need to let people know that we trust them. They can make these decisions. They're not going to get fired for a single mistake. We're going to look at their overall performance, and that's how we're going to continue to function. So I thought that was pretty impressive. And we talked earlier about how this all has to come from leadership. Like, we can do all those examples I just mentioned, but really culture should be intentional. There has to be a strategy around what is your culture going to be. It can be whatever you want it to be, but it needs to be thought of as part of your strategy. And it has to come from leadership. And so the last example I'm going to give is from Rizzoli. John Ryan's here today, one of my clients, and it struck me because they have a similar sort of culture. I started working with them a year and a half ago. I interviewed their CEO at the time, Pat Bennett, and they were bringing together, their CRO, bringing together 4 bioanalytical labs on different continents. And so that means a change in experience, not only for all their customers that are working with each of those labs, but also how those labs are going to work together with each other. And so I record the interview, we give them the full-length thing, but they take each question and answer about what they expect the culture to be, how they're going to manage it, what the integration process is going to look like. And they release those questions and answers sequentially on LinkedIn as chapters in a story. That seemed to work out well, so lately, this year I've interviewed 3, and tomorrow hopefully 4 subject matter experts, and the story that they're releasing currently this week started on Monday or Tuesday, and I think there's another episode coming out tomorrow. I interviewed their VP of Quality, David Butler, and the thing he talked about was harmonizing their quality processes across the entire organization, all their SOPs and the process they go through that, and how their quality processes bring value to the customer beyond just doing a good job, and how they think about quality in a way that can save the customer money and make things more efficient. The one thing that stood out to me that made me think this is a little bit like Netflix is they talk about this policy of, or this process of informed compliance. So does anybody know about the knowing-doing gap? What I'm talking about? So you can tell somebody what to do, but the best way to get them to do exactly what you want is that they understand why you need them to do that way. And so he explained that we make sure that everybody knows why they're going to do the things they do in their SOP. But on top of that, they want them also to think a little bit differently if something is out of the ordinary or there's a better way to do it, and they call that creative compliance. So now they know how to do things, or what the goal is, the intent of those objectives or the SOPs. They can come up with new ideas to do something better. So that's the culture thing that stood out to me, that I think a potential customer would like to know. That's information. Oh, I like how they think about that. I should look into these people. And at the same time, it's a great onboarding tool. People watch that video and go, oh, now I get what's going on here. I know what's expected me when I go to work here. So that's it. I think, that type of content can fill that gap at the top of the funnel, because you're telling people how you solve problems that they might be curious about, and at the same time communicate to the people within your company what it's going to be like to work there and what you expect. So that's how I think you might be able to reflect company culture and drive it in the same content and get an ROI for what is really a very simple process of talking to an executive or a subject matter expert and handing them the assets. And I'll take any questions. And if you want the deck, let me know.